I think it's really important to be having these honest, open and frank discussions and having prominent, I guess, First Nations people, bring to you our feelings and the way that we express ourselves. And I feel that there is a lot of people who are afraid of doing what's right and just. For us as First Nations people, we've been fighting this fight for some 200 odd years. And I'm a descendant of that. And, people freak out at the word treaty, people freak out at the word sovereignty. For us as First Nations people, we are the only country in the entire Commonwealth that does not have a treaty with its First Nations people. If you look at the instructions given to Captain Arthur Phillip when he came here in 1788, the instructions were to make peace with the natives, to not displace us and bring harm upon us. That has never been adhered to. There's a saying that, history, it depends who wrote it. And the people who wrote this history, i.e. the Terra Nullius, have been non-Indigenous people. So we're still fighting to eradicate the injustice and the lies of the Terra Nullius notion, and that was only erased in 1992. When we talk about sovereignty and treaties, this is the things that should have been done 200 years ago, 100 years ago, not in 2023. And I sort of feel the word sovereignty is our place in this landscape. Me as a First Nations woman, my sovereignty is in Arnhem Land in the Kimberleys. We as First Nations people, we're not coming to take people's homes or take your property. It's for you to understand our place, which we've been here for some 50,000 years. You come to my country in Arnhem Land, white anthropologists, archaeologists have identified that my ancestors have walked upon that country for 50,000 years. That's not us saying, that's a non-Indigenous person saying, an educated person. We know our place and we've never ceded our sovereignty to this country. We've always been able to, we've evolved with time. It's 2023, we have evolved with time, but we are responsible for maintaining our inherent responsibility, and that's to care for country.
Welcome to Think Voice. I'm Kyriakos Gold, and tonight we have unfinished business. Maria, in our last episode, we spoke about other examples of a voice, and we touched on our constitution. In Australia, what will really change? Will we be affected? Will we lose rights? What happens if we vote yes?
I think if we take it back to the Uluru Statement in 2017 itself, if you really read that statement, it's an expression of healing. It's such an inclusive and generous statement that calls for those of us that are non-Indigenous to walk together towards a country that can heal, towards a reconciliation with our past, towards a future that is grounded in justice. I think it's important to remember that the Uluru Statement from the Heart is not a political statement. It's actually offered up as a gift to Australians, all Australians. That's something worth really centering in any conversation. I think the point about the voice and enshrining it in the Constitution is that history tells us that various governments in this country simply come along and disband, defund any voice for Aboriginal people that's been established. This is a way of ensuring that a voice is protected, that it's entrenched and enshrined and not subject to the whim of politicians.
But what do we mean when we say sovereignty was never ceded?
Sovereignty was never ceded with our First Nations people, which means they never, ever handed over, signed over the rights to their land or to be able to practice their customary laws. So their autonomy has never been handed over, but they don't have autonomy. And I guess some of the things we need to think about is that previous to the last referendum concerning Aboriginal communities in this country, they were not considered to be Australians as we take for granted, which means that Aboriginals that fought in the First World War and the Second World War were not Australian citizens. They were merely cannon fodder. So these are truths that we need to know and think about. And when we think about sovereignty, generally we think about monarchies and we think about, a colonial sort of look at what that means. But for traditional communities, that is entrenched in their love and connection to earth. And what we've done is perpetuated the stealing of their children, their connection to their land, dispossession, poor health, incarceration, a whole range of things. Until we recognise those issues around sovereignty and building towards a real treaty, we're not actually going to get anywhere. In 1975, Trudeau, not Justin Trudeau, but Trudeau's father, did the first treaty in Canada. These things are possible. Not all of these, and we had the Waitangi Treaty in New Zealand. They're not perfect, but we have examples to grow from. We have examples that we can build on and respectfully be more inclusive of communities.
Just to add to what Maria was saying earlier about, building better connections and being fair and inclusive, I think one of the growing words that I see in the sector lately is the direct, almost pitched between the celebration of Australia Day and how it is justified that we are keeping the day going because of the sake of multicultural communities, because this is the day we offer them citizenship, when clearly the reality is if we were to shift that day to a better day that our entire country can be proud of, then we could offer the citizenship on that day, and that's just common sense. But I am really worried about that concern, because what I see is that it offers a justification for the continuance of, subjecting our traditional owners to such treatment, and we justify it at the back of multiculturalism. And I think it's only fair that the multicultural community in general, including policymakers, people in government, and those in a leadership position much better than mine, to come forward and completely oppose the idea that we are somehow standing in the way of progress.
We're being played in a game against each other.
Absolutely, and it's quite dangerous and it's divisive. And as a person who migrated to Australia from Livoyo refugee camp, who spent a few months in Townsville, and as you know, Townsville has a large population of traditional owners, it's the most inclusive I've ever felt in Australia. I was referred to as a sister. I was welcomed. We didn't speak the same language. I didn't know a word of English, but yet I was accommodated too. And I think, we can all have that relationship with our traditional owners if we create a space that we can all do that. And it's okay and it's respected. And, it's not just us against them as we make it out to be.
What does it mean to live on stolen land? What does it mean to us as migrants? Has anyone ever reflected on this?
I came to Australia in 1970 with my family, and I was a teenager, and fortunately I went to a very progressive high school in Collingwood, and we had regular speakers who came and told us about dispossession, who came and told us about traditions, customs, racism. And as a migrant, I was very confused because on the one hand, I felt fortunate to be here, and on the other hand, I thought, why am I here? I'm not welcome. And I remember attending a conference in 1995 approximately, where I experienced the first Welcome to Country. And it was a very emotional experience for me. And from that day on, I felt that I had the tiniest permission to be here, but I felt relieved because somebody had welcomed me onto the land.
What you've just said really resonates with me as well. My family came here in the late 50s, couldn't read and write. They come to this land. And then you grow up learning that you haven't been told so much about what happened on this land. And in the words of Gomeroi poet and activist Rob Waters, I love the fact we're talking about truth telling, but there's the truth learning that I've had to do, that I've had to teach my parents about the complicitness of Southern Europeans, the Italians, the Greeks, the Maltese, and I know Dino's part of the Mobs and Wogs project. You know, there were Italian missionaries stealing children on this stolen land. My uncle was a prisoner of war in Cowra, but there was already a prison there. The Arambi mission was a prison that we built another prison on, not we, but the Australian government. So for me, living on stolen land is walking that fine line you're talking about. I need to know more. I need to understand how my family were on the receiving end of racism and often, connected with Aboriginal people to fight the whites. But at other times, I've had to look at archives where I've seen names that I recognise of Italian men on sugarcane fields, on the mines, doing all sorts of horrible jobs where they were assaulting Aboriginal women. I have to walk that fine line.
So my personal reflection is that I've been here for nearly 40 years. I'm one of the elderly migrants that Mohammed's mentioned earlier. And my perspective is this, that I came to Australia knowing more about the Indigenous culture than many people here have. In other words, you can live your entire life and not meet an Aboriginal person. And it's particularly true for, I think, for multicultural communities, those that don't really care. And we kind of need to acknowledge that some people just don't care. They come, it's maybe selfishness, or maybe it's just, getting on with your life or dealing with your trauma or whatever it is. But I think it is all about education. And it's about things like preserving languages that we spoke here once upon a time that we no longer teach at school, where, the language is the oppressor. The English aggressive language is that we allow to permeate everything. And I think, we are preaching to the converted around the room. I want us to think about what are we going to do tomorrow when we go back to our workplaces, when we go back to our communities. What is it that I can do so I don't hang my head in shame in October? Because there's so many things I don't understand. I don't know why it's such a big deal, like this referendum. Why do we have to have a referendum? Like, to me and many other people that I hang out with, it just makes perfect sense. So I don't understand what the power plays necessarily are. And I understand a lot. I'm 55, so it's not like I was born yesterday. But there's, I think for many multicultural communities, it's not a priority. It's not something that they particularly understand or care about. And I think it is something that we need to face, that come October, they just won't either turn up or care enough to make an informed decision. So, where are all the wonderful translations for communities, right? Where is the education in our schools, in our, ethnic community centres, whatever? That's not happening yet. And we've only got 6 months to go. So I think I personally want to take responsibility for all that I'm saying and, make Australia a better place. But I think there's still, each of us needs to be accountable for where we're at.
Thank you so much for that reflection. Our answer to that, the Filipino-Australian community, because we're taking this on, a national network called Australians for Philippine Human Rights Network is taking on the campaign, and we are using champions amongst our young people. In fact, during Easter, we're going to develop our own information because this is really about community education. We need to have information out there in our languages and in the simplest explanations. As you know, we cannot be too complicated. We've experienced last year during the Australia Day, we interviewed 2 of our elders, Aboriginal elders. They're both women. And we used the video to and presented it to around 60 Filipino community leaders. I tell you, some of them were crying. See, once you actually tell them the truth and show them our First Nations
people talking about their, why, the sovereignty and all that stuff. Because we all come from colonized experiences. So there is always that connection. We understand where they're coming from. So we just have to really use the last, 4 months or 5 months, to undertake this campaign within our own communities.
We've all been colonized one way or another.
I just wanted to say that to be fair to ethnic communities, particularly people from refugee backgrounds that arrive, I guess their priority is not to find out about the Indigenous history of this country, its dispossession and all the awful things that have happened. Their focus really is on settling in and for, addressing some of those settlement issues, the immediacy of employment, housing, education for their children, and a whole range of things. And I guess one of the things that we need to be mindful of, once that process has finished, is that we don't then become imbued in a sense of lateral violence, where it's sort of them and us. And I guess often with ethnic communities, when you come to Australia, you feel safe. You think, you want to make it here, you want to educate your children, and you really want to align with the dominant culture. And with the lies that have been told about our Aboriginal communities, it's very understandable that people want to distance themselves from that. So I think we really need to focus on the alignments and think about, someone mentioned before, the context of, we understand genocide, we understand colonisation, we understand, land dispossession, and actually contextualising that for people, saying, do you know what happened in Rwanda? Do you know, and understanding that the lateral violence is also an outcome of that's perpetuated by colonisation. Okay, so, and I think we need to keep our eyes on the goal, finally, to have a treaty, and not be sort of swayed by what can happen in between.
We're just going to put a little full stop and we'll meet you next week. I'm Kyriakos Gold and this is Think Voice.